I know this is probably not any kind of news flash, but as believers, we don't really have to look very far to find examples of people who are seeking to provoke or even mock Christian faith. I mean, you don't have to look very far. I mean, you could probably, just off the top of your head, just name various experiences, examples that you've seen around that sort of thing. I come across a couple this week. One that happened just last month down in Hobart in Tasmania. Tasmania has an arts festival called Dark Mofo. And it really celebrates a lot of pagan spirituality in many ways. One of the primary things, and you may have seen this on the news, is that throughout Hobart they erected a number of upside-down crosses that were intended to be provocative. And they are provocative because, you know, one of the ideas that is attached to an upside-down cross is a symbol of the Antichrist. So you can imagine that's provocative. Found another example just from Easter time last year. There was a piercing shop put out this. Imagine this. This is at Easter time. Get nailed for $5. Taking advantage of the whole period of Good Friday and Easter to make a cheap statement about getting some piercings in their lives. How do we react to that? What should be our reaction? Should we go over there, get in their face, and punch back twice as hard? Should we just really be angry about this and say, you no good so-and-so, is God's going to get you? Should that be our response? Should we just really get wound up and just, we're just going to take it to him and we're just going to ask, be the sons of thunder again, Come on, Lord, take out this village, will you? Is that our response? Well, I ask that in light of our text today in Daniel 5. How do we respond to those kinds of provocations as believers? Well, I believe as we come to Daniel 5, there are a whole lot of messages here, but one of the messages is, I think, how to respond to the provocations that are always going to be a part of our culture going forward. Now, we come to chapter 5, and we'll catch up on the story. You need to appreciate that chapter 5 opens, it's years later. At this point, King Nebuchadnezzar's been dead over 20 years. Not only that, at this point, Daniel is now an old man. He's probably into his 80s. So a significant period of time has passed. And now there is a new king in Nebuchadnezzar's place. Actually, there are two kings. There's a co-regency going on. There's a guy named Nabonidus. I can't even say his name. But the problem is he was kind of a spiritual weirdo, and he always kept making these pilgrimages over to Arabia to try to promote this one particular god and goddess that he was really into. And that meant that back in Babylon, his son Belshazzar was staying home and running things. And so here we have Belshazzar in chapter 5 being presented to us as the king. And if you know anything about this period, it's really not a great time to be king. Sometimes it's great to be king. But then there are times when it's not. And this is one of those times that it's not. Because the Persian armies of Cyrus are taking over the kingdom of Babylon, and they're actually, even at this point, just right on the doorstep of the city of Babylon itself. And so here we come to this story. We have the Babylonians under this imminent threat, and Belshazzar has a great idea. Oh, it's been so stressful, and it's been just such a difficult time. I know, let's throw a party. Now, commentators are kind of conflicted on why he would do that. And we don't really know why he could do it. It could have been that perhaps, trying to get everybody in the same room, say, come on, we got to hang in here, trying to boost the troops and get them going. Or it could have been more fatalistic, and it's more like, well, let's eat and drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Whatever the reason, the drinks are flowing. And as the drinks are flowing, as experience has shown us, an abundance of alcohol makes us all wise and discerning. And Belshazzar, in his drunken state, has a great idea. And that's to take the party up a notch. He decides he's going to take all those sacred goblets that Nebuchadnezzar had looted from the temple in Jerusalem all those years ago and bring them here. And he says, I'll tell you what, we're going to use these to celebrate the gods of gold and silver and bronze and wood and iron and stone. And everybody thought, well, that sounds pretty cool. Yeah, let's do it. Well, that little party trick was hilarious for about 10 minutes. When suddenly, a disembodied hand appears and begins writing on the palace wall. And Belshazzar sobers up real quick. He's got enough of his wits about him to know that can't be good. He's so frightened that Scripture tells us that his legs went weak and his knees were knocking, and I suppose they're politely telling us that he probably soiled himself too. Pretty impressive, but understandable. And he sees the message that's written on the wall, and he calls his advisors, all the astrologers and all those that Nebuchadnezzar always seemed to go to first. And you know how this works out. No one can interpret what it means. Oh, they can read the words, but they don't know what it means. And in the midst of that confusion and all that fear, the queen mother enters and reminds Belshazzar that, hey, there is one guy who can do this. He's done it in the past. He did it for your grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. Got to keep the name straight. There is one guy that can do this, and his name is Daniel. And that's where we begin reading our text from chapter 5, beginning at verse 12. Call for Daniel, and he'll tell you what the writing means. So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I've heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you'll be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered the king, You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Your Majesty, the Most High God, gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You've had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and your nobles and your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. And you praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. And here's what these words mean. Mene. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple. A gold chain was placed around his neck. And he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. This is the word of the Lord. What a story. It's been remarkable going through Daniel, that just to re-engage with these incredible things that are going on at such a high level in the Babylonian culture. So here we have Daniel being introduced into this bacchanal that Belshazzar has decided to throw. And it strikes me that as Daniel entered into this room, he would have found that he was being confronted with so very much that provoked him. So very much to see these sacred objects that had been looted from the temple being used in such a trashy way, in such an idolatrous way. Yet here he was, once again, thrust onto the center stage of God's dealings with the Babylonians. And again, the question becomes, what can we find here to guide us as we get confronted and provoked over things in our own culture? Well, I'll suggest some things. First thing you notice about this is that Daniel really didn't inject himself into this situation. He was invited. He was invited. Now, why wasn't Daniel called upon earlier? Don't really know. I mean, he's got a good track record. He's been there before. I don't know, maybe he was considered too old. Maybe all the young Turks, all these young, vibrant leaders thought, well, what does that old man know? Maybe they just kind of wrote him off. Sound familiar? The point is that none of us ever know at what stage of life that God might call us into a significant purpose. We never know at what stage. In Daniel, it happened when he was a teenager. And now still in his 80s. God's opening up doors of opportunity to give witness and testimony. And Daniel was ready. I'm intrigued by this, particularly this fact that Daniel gets invited in. It's a reminder that for all of his years in Babylon, for all the difficulties that had been associated with that long period of exile, for all the things and all the give and take he had to go through during that time, there was still a foundation in Daniel's life of integrity. And an integrity that maintained through it all a deep faith and trust in the Lord himself. A deep sense that even though I'm in this place, God is still at work. And even though I'm in this place that I would never have chosen, I'm going to keep my ears open and my eyes open. And I'm going to wait and see if there might be opportunities in some way that Lord's going to use this time in this place. Use me here. And it was that consistent faith that made a deep impression, even on the pagans of Babylon. My friends, I guess here's a challenge for us. In our increasingly hostile world, can we live with such a degree of integrity, such a degree of faith and graciousness, that even those who disagree with us respect us, and respect us enough to be willing to invite us into their lives and their circumstances? We go on. Not only was Daniel invited into this situation, I believe he went with a real humility. It's interesting. It isn't immediately obvious, but when Daniel shows up, Belshazzar starts this whole time by basically insulting Daniel. Are you one of those exiles that Nebuchadnezzar brought in here from Judah? Little power play going on there, just reminding, Daniel who he is. He's kind of like he's giving him that kind of handshake, the power handshake, just to make sure we know who's top dog here. Are you one of those old exiles? Yeah, it was not too subtle a put down. But then Belshazzar offers Daniel the opportunity to receive wealth and power if he can answer the writing on the wall. Yeah, I have to chuckle about it. He's going to make him the third ruler in Babylon. That's going to last about 1 hour. So, it was not much of an offer, but hey, it was there. But, you think, what an emotional roller coaster for Daniel. He just walks in here and Daniel says to him, in humility, keep your gifts. I'm not here for money or fame or power. I'm not in this for me. I come in the name and as a representative of another. And then in humility, it's almost like Daniel begins with a conversation. A conversation that begins to make all kinds of historical connections that has led up to this moment. He reminds Belshazzar of his grandfather's experience. He reminds him how that Nebuchadnezzar was great, that God's hand was upon him, and God made him great. He was great in power. He was great in splendor. He was an amazing sort of king. He was a king that even though he was not Jewish, God used him. But when his ego got the best of him, God humbled him. God humbled him until he, Nebuchadnezzar, acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. And that's what we looked at last week. Nebuchadnezzar getting his comeuppance and being reminded who it is that is truly in charge. And Daniel's message seems to be to Belshazzar, God did that to the great Nebuchadnezzar. You know all this. It wasn't done in a corner. Yet you refused to learn the lesson. You refused to hear the message that God was speaking to your grandfather. And here's where things get interesting. Yes, Daniel was invited in. And yes, Daniel came in humility. And yes, he started a conversation. But his example reminds us, humility is not timidity. Humility is not timidity. Daniel was unflinching in this moment. And he was unapologetic about God's message in this moment. Belshazzar wanted to know the truth. He couldn't handle the truth. He wanted to know. And so, he got it. God sent him a faithful, humble servant to tell him the truth. And Daniel said, here's the deal, Belshazzar. You've not humbled yourself. You've not learned the lessons of your grandfather. You did not honor the God who holds in his hands your life and ways. And for that reason, he's crashed your party. Mene, tekel, parsin. Beloved, here's what we need to see. It wasn't that others couldn't read the words on the wall. They're common terms for weights and measures. So if they couldn't read it, they just couldn't figure out, well, what does it mean? You know, it's just like somebody put on the wall here, all you think is pounds and ounces and things, sorry, that's my American coming out, but, grams and kilos and, people, well, yeah, I can read it, but what's that mean? Same thing there. They could read it, but what does it mean? Well, Daniel standing there in that moment knows what it means. It struck me, it's kind of like what Jesus said to his disciples in Luke 12. He warned them that there were going to be times when they're going to be in some pretty dicey circumstances. There are going to be times when you're going to be in very awkward and very pressurized situations. And Jesus said to them, when you're brought before rulers and authorities, do not worry how you will defend yourselves or what you will say. For the Holy Spirit will teach you at that time what you should say. I honestly believe that when Daniel walked in the room, he didn't know what it meant. I sincerely believe that in that moment, he received revelation. The very revelation that he needed in that moment to speak to Belshazzar what these words meant. There's something there for us too, that as we get in those kinds of situations, I know I tend to panic. I think, oh, Lord, I want the best answer possible. And I'll think. Sometimes I think we just need to relax and trust what the Spirit of God is wanting to do through us. And trust that, what may come out of our mouth may not be the most wise and profound thing ever, but it may be exactly what the Lord wants to say in that circumstance. If we will just trust that the Lord is in that place with us, just like Daniel did in that moment. And Daniel had such a trust in the Lord's presence and activity. He was living this truth of Jesus even in the Old Testament. And Daniel gives Belshazzar God's message. Mene, tekel, parsin. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. You've been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Beloved, I think here is wisdom for us. We come in humility, seeking conversation. When we see those things like the provocations down in Hobart last month, we see things like that. I think we need to just kind of take a deep breath and maybe ask the question, well, how could this become a conversation? How could this be steered away from my own sense of outrage and my own offense and actually be turned in a direction where it actually becomes a deeply spiritual conversation? I think there's something to be learned in that. I think there's something to be practiced in that. I think there's something that reflects Jesus in that. Because whatever my response is to whatever the provocation is, I want people first and foremost to see a Jesus-like response from me. I want them to see something of the nature of Jesus. I want them to see something of his graciousness and his kindness. It's something of his wisdom. So I think when we see offense like that, I think in humility, We approach those things and ask, how might this become a conversation? But again, humility is not timidity. For the message of Christ is, at the end of the day, filled with great urgency. God has written on the wall of every human life. God has written on the wall of every one of our lives. He's written in His own way that the truth that all have sinned and fallen short of God's standards. All of us have been weighed and found wanting. And just like Belshazzar, there is a day of accounting that's coming for all of us. Sometimes our message, in the midst of our conversation, needs to be sure to include the truth. It's kind of like John the Baptist. You know, as in the opening of the gospel, John the Baptist, he suddenly appears on the stage, and part of his message in preparation for the coming of Jesus is the axe is being laid to the root of the tree. And every tree that does not bear good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire. Sometimes we need to make that point. Not in anger, not in vengeance, not in a sense of, I can't wait to tell you this because I want God to get you really. I just can't wait till He gets you back. We do it. The truth sometimes, even as difficult as it may sound, is one of the greatest acts of love that we can ever perform. Sometimes we have to say to our friends and our loved ones and our neighbors and our work colleagues, the axe is being laid to the root. Things aren't always going to be like this. A day of accounting is before us all. And if that's a harsh truth, it is the truth that paves the way for the great good news of Jesus. That great good news that God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish, but have eternal life. That old adage is true. You need to understand the bad news and its urgency to truly appreciate the good news. It's interesting, for Belshazzar, time had run out. God's patience finally came to an end with him and the Babylonian regime. He'd ignored all the truths that God had spoken to his family and to him. And then it was in that night that his hands fell into the hands of God that very night. I'll conclude with this. If you're here today and you have ignored the truth of God for your life, I pray that the experience of Belshazzar can somehow be a wake-up call to you spiritually. You have the opportunity to change your future's outcome. You have an opportunity that Belshazzar didn't get on this night. You have an opportunity to respond to God in the ways that He calls all of us to, the way that most of us in this room have already done. As we realize that we are all facing a day where we have to give an account of our lives, that we're all facing the fact that God's judgment is justified in our lives. But we also realize, as we've come around this table earlier today, to remember the cross of Jesus, that God's call is that He loves us. He wants none of that to be true in our lives. And our response is to repent, to turn away from all the things that have been in our lives that have caused us to ignore God, to believe in Jesus, to believe that through His death on the cross, that God actually removed that threat of wrath and judgment from our lives forever? That we now stand before God free and cleansed and healed and new? And that God is willingly calling you into a new future through Jesus, His Son. Maybe that's something for someone that's here today. Or maybe that's something that you need to take to someone that's very near to you today. Mene, tekel, parsin. Let him who has ears to hear, let him hear. You know, Jesus said that to us, to you, you're the light of the world. You know, a city set on a hill, its light can't not be hidden. It's interesting as I look at Daniel, he was that light planted in a really dark place. And that light shone in some magnificent ways. Because Daniel was planted in that place, there was so much that transpired that gave honor to God. As the light of the world, as one possessed of the Spirit of the living God, as you go into this week, maybe God's going to take you into some dark places. Don't be afraid. Don't be intimidated. Be humble, but not timid. And may the Lord give you grace to be His light in that place. God bless you, my friends. Have a great week.